Okay, so as I said, a key reason we're doing this, not only does it kind of interact and grow out of the broader story of East Asia, but it's a big part of our life and community here in central Wisconsin, and we wanted to fit that in a broader narrative for you. So the Hmong Experience. So to kind of get an appreciation for this, I want to give you a quick recap of the Vietnam War. We're not going to go into a lot of detail in this. I know you got it in US too, but I just want to remind you that the whole project of the Vietnam War was really an outgrowth of this Vietnamese independence movement that had been growing and building. It was largely congregated in North Vietnam, but it of course spreads throughout the broader region. By the 1950s and 1960s, Vietnam was divided between a communist north and a non-communist south. The independence movement of the Vietnamese wanted to unify it under one rule and have one independent state. It was led by the charismatic individual Ho Chi Minh. He plays a big role in fomenting and building a revolution, an independence movement that can succeed. And it had some big successes up to this point. By the time the U.S. shows up in Vietnam in the 1950s and 60s, Ho Chi Minh's independence movement had defeated the Japanese. It had defeated the French as they tried to reestablish their colonial empire in Vietnam after the Second World War. It had long resisted the Chinese going back thousands of years. So it's important to be sensitive and mindful of the fact that when the North Vietnamese independence movement meets the Americans in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s, it had this in their mind. It was playing a long game of independence. This was also a communist independence movement. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, but independence was a big priority for him, equally, if not more so, than an ideological commitment to communism. As for how the U.S. comes into this picture, remember, it's the 1950s and 1960s. The U.S. is very fearful of the fact that communism could spread. So it's looking at this broader context of resisting the Soviet Union, the policy of containment, stopping the spread of communism, and making sure market capitalism and democracy is the dominant model for the rest of the world. So it looks at Vietnam as a case test for that. If you really believe in resisting communists, a lot of American policymakers say Vietnam may not be the most significant spot in the world, may not have the most economic, productive importance, but if we're going to stop the spread of communism, we got to do it here. And that's what brings the U.S. to this struggle. The U.S. gradually takes over the role. When the French are eventually driven out by the North Vietnamese in the 1950s, the U.S. sort of gradually commits. And from the 1950s to the early 1970s, that's the Vietnam War that the U.S. knows. And it really accelerates in the mid-1960s. That's the part that we tend to remember. But it's this long struggle on the part of the U.S. to prop up a non-communist South against a communist North who wants to unify. That's the big picture item here. Gradualist approach kind of allows the U.S. to fight the war on the cheap, and this is ideal. I mean, anybody who has to fight a war doesn't want to do so for extreme costs. They don't want to get in unpredictable situations. They don't want huge expenses to overwhelm their other priorities. So the U.S. commits to this gradualist approach, tries to avoid major commitments. In reality, this looks like sort of a drip, 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 gradually becoming involved, problems gradually expanding, and coming to terms with those. The U.S. population gradually loses support for the war. It starts off actually really strong. A large portion of public opinion says, yes, fight in Vietnam, resist communism, we're in this. This is the Cold War, this is what we do. But by 1968, as losses continue to mount and uncertainty about whether South Vietnam can really make itself as an independent nation, that causes a lot of doubts to creep into the American public. And it really sours the public's commitment to the war. So I want Johnson and the administration, the American policymakers, are looking for any friend they can to get the North Vietnamese to quit, to prop up the South, to keep communism from spreading. They're for doing anything, whether it's increasing the bombing. They don't want to up the U.S. commitments because there's all sorts of political problems associated with that. But Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese are very effective about
building up their forces in the South and making life difficult for the Americans. I want to point out this map here and highlight a couple things on here for you, because this is what brings the Hmong experience to life within the Vietnam War. The broader political military situation here is the U.S. is backing the Communist South, trying to keep it from, the U.S. is trying to prevent communism in the South. The Communist North wants to unify with the South and make it one unified country. But to do that, the North Vietnamese have to pump men and supplies to keep the Viet Cong going in the South, to harass the Americans, to make their life difficult. But in order to get those supplies to the South, they have to go through the neighboring country of Laos. Laos is the key. At one point, President Eisenhower, as he's observing the situation in the late 50s, he says it's the cork that keeps the whole thing contained. Laos, that is. And the reason the North Vietnamese are trying to do this is because Laos is a very rural country. It's very mountainous. You can traffic supplies, whether it's trucks, ammunition, people, through there, get them to the South under the cover without the Americans really being able to do anything about it. This is what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It's a logistical complex of moving supplies into the South. And the U.S. looks at this, they look at Laos, as a real choke point. That if they can cut off those supplies, if they could cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, whether it's initially through bombing, that would make their life all the easier. Every truck, every piece of ammunition, every soldier that the North Vietnamese can't get to the South, that's a win for the United States, strategically. So the U.S. is going to look to Laos, too, as an important part. But bombing can't do the trick. To cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the U.S. has to look to a group of people that could potentially be a friend. You saw Johnson's frustration there. Bombing wasn't working. So the U.S. reaches out, going back to the early 1960s, to what is called the Hmong people. The Hmong, or the Miao, as they would be called, as classified as both an ethnic and a language group, have their origins in southern China. Thousands of years ago, they migrate from southern China and they settle in this portion of Southeast Asia. They're very closely clustered and concentrated in northern Laos, particularly in the mountainous region. They're very rural people. They live on subsistence agriculture for the most part. And the society is built around kind of clan authority, so it's very diffused. There's not a central organized state necessarily that binds them all together. But the reality of the situation is the U.S. is looking for friends. And in return, the Hmong are also looking for their own independence. The communist movements of the North Vietnamese had spread into Laos. They were trying to build up communist forces and were making life difficult for the Hmong people as well. So they looked at the Americans as a potential ally as well. And that's kind of what brings these two groups, the American and the Hmong people, together. Here's this quote I just want to introduce. We're not going to be analyzing it, but it's a quote from the head of Laotian education in the 1960s. His name was Mua Lia. He says, "Foreigners should know that why we fight for so long in Military Region 2, which we were just looking at. We fight not for another country, not for another person. We are not the mercenaries of the Americans, the English, or the French. No, we fight to defend our own freedom. We know that this land belongs to us. We were born there, so we fight against the communists. Who are the communists? These would be the Vietnamese. We fight to continue. We continue to fight the North Vietnamese until we withdraw from our land. We fight from the 1940s. So this is a long game struggle on the part of the Hmong as well. They want to resist the communists as well, who are building up their own movement known as the Pathet Lao, which we'll talk about in a bit. So this brings us to the secret war, the interaction between the Hmong and the Americans. Back in the early 1960s, U.S. policymakers had identified the Ho Chi Minh Trail as a real problem. That was the linkage point, the connection point that allowed the North to keep life difficult for the Americans and the South Vietnamese in South Vietnam. So the CIA reaches out to the Hmong people in rural, mountainous Laos. And what it wants to do is it wants to enlist the Hmongs for a proxy army, an army that could be supplied from the outside, but they will be doing the fighting. to harass and stall the communist forces in Laos who are trying to pump supplies and people down into South Vietnam. They back a guy named General Vang Pao. That's Vang Pao you see right there. He's going to be a very charismatic military leader for the Laotian people, and he's going to rally a lot of support from the Hmong population in the rural hills of Laos. So what are the objectives for the Hmong fighters? Now that they're committed, the U.S. is looking for friends anywhere it can. What are they telling the Hmong that they need from them? Here are three objectives. First part's kind of twofold. Number one, the U.S. wants them to block supply routes. Yeah?
Don't they also use guerrilla warfare?
Yeah, we're going to get to that. Yep. Block supply routes. If you can stop material from moving through the Ho Chi Minh Trail and getting to the south, your life as the Americans is that much the easier. And here's what you were saying, Jacob. They want the Hmong to engage the communists when they can with hit-and-run guerrilla fighting. Obviously, this proxy army is not going to be fully developed to fight a straight-up war, but if they can engage in hit-and-run tactics and damage and harass and blow up bridges and do any sorts of things they can to make life difficult for the North Vietnamese, all that much the better for the Americans. They need them to rescue American pilots. Pilots are highly trained military personnel. The U.S. is flying bombing missions all over Laos, even though this is technically not supposed to happen because Laos is a neutral, independent nation. The U.S. is not supposed to officially be conducting warfare in Laos. That's why they call it the secret war. The Hmong are trained to rescue American pilots, get them back to their headquarters, and keep those pilots flying. They also have an important role in defending radar stations throughout the hillsides and mountains of Laos. The U.S. needs to maintain those radar stations for reliable communications. It's running a much more complicated war effort throughout the region. So that's what we mean by the secret war, and Vang Pao and the Hmong are going to be right at the center of that. So U.S. operations in Laos. It has to be secret, I just mentioned, because Laos is an independent, neutral state. By the rules of international behavior, the U.S. can't go into a neutral country that's not part of the warfare, or the warfare in Vietnam, and start pumping in military personnel and supplies and conducting the war however it wishes. It's doing so secretly. The North Vietnamese are also doing this secretly when they're running the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So Laos just has the misfortune of bordering this very contested country. The North Vietnamese need Laos to supply their insurgency, as I just mentioned, because if that insurgency can't be supplied, the South will be supported by the Americans. So they look at Laos as a key transportation link. The U.S. ups the operation quite a bit. They launch what's called Operation Barrel Roll. Later on, they'll launch what's called Operation Rolling Thunder. These are massive bombing campaigns to limit the movement of supplies through Laos. And the U.S. also takes the next step. It starts secretly building up a Laotian and Thai Air Force that trains pilots. There are actually going to be Hmong fighters who are trained to become pilots, and this is no small feat because many of them are from rural agricultural regions of Laos. Many of them will not have any experience in operating vehicles, let alone flying planes, but the U.S. is going to eventually commit to that and train Hmong pilots. Eventually, the Hmong are going to suffer such great losses that they're eventually going to have to turn to teenage soldiers to keep the operation going. So there's a real commitment on their part. As I mentioned, pilots are even trained. There's this one instance here of a gentleman named Li Lu, who's going to be a trained Hmong pilot. What's interesting about Li Lu is he's actually not even going to drive a car until after the age of 30. And within a couple years, he's flying planes on behalf of the American war effort, on behalf of the Hmong war effort in the secret war through Laos and Thailand. Americans are all throughout Laos in kind of this small role where they will show up and train Hmong soldiers to carry out the war. It's no small feat to do what the Hmong are doing, or what they're being asked to do, which is enlist on the side of the Americans, to take their life in their own hands, to back an outside power that they hope will win, they think will win and prevail, but if they don't, if the American project to prop up South Vietnam fails, and the communists win, that puts the Hmong in a very difficult position. They've backed the wrong side. So these Hmong fighters you see here, they're taking some incredible risks and endangering their own security in a big way if the American war effort doesn't pan out. So you know how the story ends, because you took US 2. The US fails to stop communism in Southeast Asia. It fails to continue to keep South Vietnam non-communist. By 1975, the South falls to the North. Vietnam is unified under one communist rule. And this puts the Hmong in the situation that it really can only be described as horrific. Because they backed the Americans, they're going to be targeted by communist forces both inside and outside of Laos. Some Hmong fighters and their families, the ones who had been committed since the beginning, are going to be evacuated, but there's no real sophisticated plan to evacuate tens of thousands of people from Laos. At one point, by the end, a third of Laos is going to be in some sort of refugee status. And many of these are going to be Hmong people who side with the Americans. The communist forces within Laos, known as the Pathet Lao, who are trained up and supported by the North Vietnamese, they launched these vicious revenge attacks against anyone in Laos, but particularly the Hmong people who helped the Americans. And thousands of Hmong, now trapped in the teeth of this war that went badly and the Americans leave. And they rescue some, but they can't rescue all, or they choose not to rescue all. They will have to figure out their own exit plan. And that exit plan is fraught with all sorts of danger. Thousands of Hmongs are going to flee to Thailand. Thailand is a neighboring country to the west. If they can get to Thailand, which is no guarantee, they could be safe temporarily from the vengeful communist forces that threaten them. The U.S. is eventually going to evacuate thousands of Hmong refugees who make it out of Laos on their own, by their own efforts, and allow them to immigrate to the United States in the 1970s and 80s, but only after years of delay. Many Hmong people who escaped this terrible, horrific situation are going to spend years, in many cases, in Thai refugee camps, only making it to the U.S. later. So I just want to put in perspective for you before we see this film clip here, Laos after the war. Some amazing statistics here that often we don't think of. The U.S. during the entire Vietnam War will fly 580,000 bombing missions over Laos in an attempt to bust up and break up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It will drop over 260 million bombs, many of which will remain unexploded, undetonated. So we have this kind of human rights catastrophe going on in Laos on a number of levels, both people being targeted by the communists for helping the Americans, but also much of the country is at risk from unexploded bombs. The U.S. is going to use what are called cluster bombs. They look like kind of metal softballs, essentially, what you see up there in the upper right-hand corner. And many of them don't detonate, and civilians, particularly children who look at them and they look kind of like toys, will come across these and they'll explode and kill people and maim people. This picture down at the bottom is from when President Barack Obama went to Laos in, I believe it was 2015. And he makes mention of this, that the U.S. dropped millions of bombs, many of them are unexploded, and there's no systemic, well-funded plan to get rid of them. The U.S. is going to drop more bombs in Laos than it drops during the entirety of World War II. Laos is the most heavily bombed country that the U.S. has ever bombed in its history. It's really just a remarkable set of events that occurs there. And President Obama is going to make mention of that. So, here's